November 17th, 1962. Villa Venice nightclub, Chicago. Vinnie Torino had been polishing glasses behind that mahogany bar for 8 years. He'd seen politicians. He'd seen mobsters. He'd never seen anything like this. Robert Kennedy walked straight through Sam Giancana's private booth area, grabbed Phyllis McGuire by the wrist, pulled her close. 300 witnesses held their breath. Sam Giancana, the man who controlled Chicago, who'd killed for looking at him wrong, just sat there, stone-faced, calm, like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. What Bobby whispered in Phyllis's ear that night changed everything. The mob wars that followed, the assassination plots, the way history got written. For 60 years, Vinnie kept his mouth shut about what he heard, about what Giancana knew, about why the most dangerous man in America let Robert Kennedy walk out alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ice in Bobby Kennedy's whiskey had barely melted when he made his move. Vinnie's hands froze mid-polish, the glass slipping slightly in his grip as the Attorney General of the United States stood up from his corner table. The Villa Venice had gone quiet in that particular way that meant trouble, not the sudden silence of surprise, but the gradual hush of predators sensing bigger predators in their territory. Bobby moved like he owned the place. Hell, maybe he did. In 1962, the lines between who owned what in Chicago had gotten so blurred that even Vinnie, who'd been mixing drinks for made men since Eisenhower was president, couldn't keep track anymore. The mahogany bar reflected the amber light from the crystal chandeliers, casting shadows that danced across Bobby's face as he walked past. Vinnie had served him twice tonight neat whiskey, no conversation, cash on the table, the kind of customer who didn't want to be remembered. But you don't forget serving drinks to the brother of the president, especially not in Sam Giancana's territory. Phyllis McGuire sat in the horseshoe booth like a queen holding court, her sequin dress catching the light every time she laughed at something one of Giancana's lieutenants whispered. She was beautiful in that untouchable way that got men killed in Chicago, the kind of woman who knew exactly how dangerous she was and wore it like perfume. Sam himself held the center of the booth, a compact man whose stillness made everyone around him nervous. Vinnie had watched him for 8 years, had seen him give orders with nothing more than a glance, had served him wine while he decided which union leader would disappear that week. Giancana didn't gesture when he talked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, which made what happened next impossible to believe. Bobby Kennedy reached the booth and didn't slow down, didn't ask permission, didn't acknowledge the 4 bodyguards who'd started reaching for their jackets. He just extended his hand to Phyllis like he was asking for a dance. "Mrs. McGuire," Bobby said, his Boston accent cutting through the jazz piano like a blade. "A moment." Phyllis looked up at him with those green eyes that had launched 1,000 rumors about her and Jack Kennedy. She glanced at Sam, who was watching Bobby with the expression of a man studying an interesting insect. "Of course, Mr. Attorney General." Her voice was honey over broken glass. She took Bobby's hand and he pulled her to her feet in one smooth motion, but instead of leading her away from the booth, he drew her closer, close enough that her perfume mixed with his cologne, close enough that when he leaned down to whisper in her ear, his lips almost brushed her skin. The entire nightclub held its breath. Vinnie found himself leaning forward across the bar, straining to hear over the blood pounding in his ears. 3 tables away, a congressman stopped mid-sentence with his fork halfway to his mouth. The piano player's hands hesitated over the keys for just a moment long enough to let the silence stretch like a rubber band about to snap. Bobby's whisper was so quiet that Vinnie almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. "Moscow sends their regards about the photographs." Phyllis went rigid. Not the kind of surprise you fake, but the bone-deep shock of someone whose world just shifted off its axis. Her eyes darted to Sam, then back to Bobby, then to Sam again. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, nobody moved. Then Sam Giancana smiled. It wasn't the smile Vinnie had seen him use on politicians or business partners. It wasn't even the cold smile he wore when someone was about to die. This was something else entirely, the smile of a man who'd just lost a chess game he didn't know he was playing. "Sit down, Bobby," Sam said, his voice as casual as if he were talking to his nephew. "You're making my customers nervous." Bobby released Phyllis's hand and stepped back, but he didn't sit. "Just wanted to make sure Mrs. McGuire understood the evening's entertainment." "I think she understands perfectly." Sam's eyes never left Bobby's face. "Don't you, sweetheart?" Phyllis sank back into the booth, her complexion 3 shades paler than it had been 30 seconds ago. She reached for her martini with hands that trembled just enough for Vinny to notice. "Crystal clear," she whispered. Bobby nodded once, turned on his heel and walked back to his table like nothing had happened. He downed his whiskey in one swallow, left a $20 bill that covered drinks for half the bar and headed for the door. Sam Giancana watched him go, still wearing that strange smile. The piano player found his rhythm again. Conversations resumed. Ice clinked against glass. But Vinny kept staring at that booth, at the way Phyllis couldn't quite meet Sam's eyes, at the way Sam's smile never wavered. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somehow, Vinny knew that everyone who'd witnessed it, including him, had just become part of something that would either make history or bury them all. If this story is grabbing you by the throat like it grabbed Vinny that night, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we're diving deep into what those photographs really contained and why they were worth killing for. Drop a comment below and let me know, what do you think Bobby Kennedy really knew about Sam Giancana's operation? Vinny's hand still held the glass he'd been polishing when Bobby Kennedy walked out, but now it felt like dead weight. The crystal tumbler, one of the Villa Venice's finest, caught the amber light from the chandeliers, throwing fractured rainbows across his knuckles. He'd been gripping it so tight during the confrontation that his fingers had gone numb. "Moscow sends their regards about the photographs." The words echoed in his head like a death sentence. 43 years old, and Vincent Torino thought he'd seen everything the Chicago underworld could throw at him. He'd watched Tony Accardo split a man's skull with a baseball bat over a $50 debt. He'd served drinks while contracts were negotiated on senators and judges. He'd mixed cocktails for Marilyn Monroe while she waited for Jack Kennedy to finish a phone call with Khrushchev. But this, whatever had just passed between Bobby Kennedy and Sam Giancana, felt different, bigger, like standing too close to a dynamite fuse and smelling the smoke. The horseshoe booth had returned to its illusion of normalcy. Giancana's lieutenants resumed their conversation about racetrack percentages. Phyllis McGuire toyed with her martini olive, but Vinny noticed she hadn't taken a sip since Bobby walked away. Her sequin dress still caught the light, but now it seemed to reflect something colder, more desperate. Vinny. Sam Giancana knew everything that happened in his territory, down to which of his bartenders were about to become fathers. The knowledge sat in Vinny's stomach like a cold stone. "Yes, sir, February. Beautiful thing, family." Sam reached into his jacket, a motion that made the bodyguards at the booth tense until they saw it was just his wallet. He peeled off 3 crisp hundreds and laid them on the bar. "For the baby, little something extra for Christmas." Vinny stared at the money. $300 was more than he made in 2 months. It was enough to move Maria somewhere safer, maybe get a place with a real nursery instead of the corner they'd been fixing up in their bedroom. It was also a chain around his neck, bought and paid for. "That's very generous, Mr. Giancana." "I take care of people who take care of me, Vinny. You understand that, don't you?" Behind Sam, Phyllis McGuire finally lifted her martini. Her hand shook just enough to send ripples across the surface. Whatever photographs Bobby Kennedy had been talking about, whatever Moscow had to do with anything, it had rattled her down to her bones. "I understand, sir." "Good." Sam tapped the bar twice with his knuckles, a sound like a judge's gavel. "Because tonight never happened. Bobby Kennedy was never here. That conversation you didn't hear, it really didn't happen. You follow me?" Vinny nodded, his throat too dry for words. The weight of the evening pressed down on his shoulders like a funeral shroud. In the corner of his vision, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror behind the bar, a young man with tired eyes and hands that had started to shake. Sam turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Vinny, you might want to take a vacation after New Year's, someplace warm. Take your wife, make a baby moon out of it." His smile was paternal, almost kind. Chicago winters can be hard on expectant mothers. The message was crystal clear: disappear for a while, let whatever was coming blow over, and pray that silence really was golden. As Sam returned to his booth, Vinny pocketed the $300 and tried not to think about what he'd just sold. Outside the Villa Venice's windows, snow had begun to fall on Chicago's dark streets, each flake catching the neon light like falling stars, or like ashes from something burning. Vinny bolted upright in his Key West bedroom, 40 years of careful silence shattered by the shrill electronic cry that cut through the humid Florida darkness. Next to him, Carmen stirred but didn't wake. 35 years of marriage to a former Chicago bartender had taught her to sleep through most disturbances. The ceiling fan whirred overhead, pushing the same thick air in lazy circles while sweat beaded on Vinny's forehead. He'd been dreaming about snow again, Chicago snow, falling past the Villa Venice windows like ash from a funeral pyre. The phone kept ringing. Vinny's feet hit the cool tile floor, muscle memory guiding him through the darkness toward the kitchen. 3:47 in the morning meant emergency or mistake. Nobody called Torino's Tavern at this hour unless something had gone very wrong. His arthritis complained as he reached for the receiver, joints stiff from the previous day's work behind his own bar 6 blocks from Duval Street. "Torino's," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Carmen. Silence, then breathing slow, deliberate, the kind that raised the hair on the back of his neck. "Vincent." The voice hit him like a punch to the solar plexus, deep, gravelly, with that particular Chicago accent that had haunted his dreams for 4 decades. Impossible, because the man who owned that voice had been found dead in his basement kitchen in 1975, shot 7 times in the head and neck while frying sausages for dinner. "Who is this?" "You know who it is, Vinny. Question is, do you remember what you promised me?" Vinny's knees went weak. He gripped the kitchen counter, his wedding ring clicking against the formica surface, the same nervous sound it had made against the mahogany bar at the Villa Venice when Sam Giancana had laid those $300 in front of him like pieces of silver. "'Cause tonight never happened." "Sam's dead," Vinny whispered. "Been dead 47 years. Death's funny that way in Chicago, Vinny. Sometimes it don't take the first time." A pause, the sound of ice clinking against glass. "Besides, I ain't the one you should be worried about." Through the kitchen window, Vinny could see the palm trees swaying in his backyard, their fronds catching the glow from the neighbor's security light. Peaceful, normal, everything he'd built in Key West to forget the weight of what he'd witnessed that December night in 1962. "What do you want?" "Nothing from you. You kept your mouth shut like a good boy. Moved down to Paradise, married a nice girl, never talked to no reporters or FBI agents or documentary filmmakers asking questions about Bobby Kennedy and photographs in Moscow." The caller knew about Emma Chen, the documentary filmmaker who'd been sniffing around town for the past week, asking locals about Chicago transplants, showing faded photographs of the Villa Venice. Vinny had avoided her, crossed streets when he saw her coming, told Carmen they were eating dinner at home instead of going to their usual restaurant. But see, Vinny, things are changing. Old secrets got a way of bubbling up, especially when certain people start digging in the right graves. Another clink of ice. "Your friend Miss Chen, she's got connections. Federal connections, the kind that don't take no for an answer." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Course you don't. Just like you didn't see Bobby Kennedy grab Phyllis McGuire in front of God and everybody. Just like you didn't hear him mention Moscow in photographs. Just like you don't know that Phyllis wasn't really Sam's girl at all." The words hung in the humid air like smoke. Vinny felt the careful architecture of his 40-year silence beginning to crack, foundation stones shifting under pressure he'd convinced himself would never come. "That's impossible." "Is it? Think about it, Vinny. Really think. Why would the Attorney General of the United States walk into Sam Giancana's territory and grab his woman? Why would he whisper about Moscow in a room full of witnesses? Why would Sam just sit there and smile instead of having Bobby killed before he reached the door? Because it was theater. Because everyone was playing a part. Because Bobby Kennedy hadn't been threatening Phyllis McGuire, he'd been delivering a message to his own asset. "She was working for him," Vinny breathed. "Smart boy. Always were smarter than you let on. Yeah, Phyllis was Bobby's inside girl, had been for months before that night. And what you saw at the Villa Venice, that was Bobby telling her the operation was blown. Moscow had pictures of her passing information, and the whole thing was about to come apart." The phone felt heavy in Vinny's hand. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance ambulance or police, someone else's emergency cutting through the Key West night. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow morning Miss Chen is going to knock on your door. She's going to show you documents that prove everything I just said. FBI files, CIA communications, photographs of Phyllis meeting with federal agents." A long pause. "And she's going to tell you that your silence is the only thing standing between the truth and your granddaughter's college fund." The line went dead. "Vincent, honey, what's wrong?" He couldn't answer. How do you explain that the past had just reached through 40 years of careful distance to grab you by the throat? That a dead man's voice had torn apart everything you'd built to stay safe? Carmen took the phone from his numb fingers and guided him to the kitchen table. She'd been through this before: the night terrors, the sudden silences, the way he sometimes stared at nothing like he was seeing ghosts. She'd learned not to push, just to wait and let him find his way back to the present. But this felt different, bigger. "I need to call in sick," Vinny said finally. His voice sounded like sandpaper. "Can you handle the bar today?" Carmen nodded, though concern creased the corners of her eyes. In 35 years of marriage, Vincent Torino had never missed a day of work. Not for hurricanes, not for his father's funeral, not even when he'd had pneumonia 2 winters back and could barely stand. "Should I call Dr. Martinez?" "No doctors." The words came out sharper than he intended. "Just, I need to think." After Carmen left for Torino's tavern, Vinny paced his small house like a caged animal. Every sound made him jump: the mail truck backfiring, the neighbor's dog barking, the air conditioner cycling on. He found himself checking the locks on doors and windows, drawing curtains he hadn't touched in years. "Your granddaughter's college fund." Sophia was 16, bright as a lighthouse beam, already talking about pre-med at University of Florida. Carmen's pride and joy, the granddaughter who called them every Sunday from Tampa, where she lived with her mother. The girl who wore Vincent eyes and had never known why her grandfather sometimes went quiet when certain songs played on the radio. The caller, whatever phantom from Chicago's graveyard had reached him, knew about Sophia, knew where she went to school, where the money was saved, knew exactly which nerve to press to make him bleed. At 10:15, a car door slammed in his driveway. Vinny peered through the front curtains and felt his stomach drop. Emma Chen stood on his porch, early 30s, professional but approachable, carrying a leather messenger bag that probably cost more than most people in Key West made in a week. She'd been patient for 6 days, asking around town about Chicago transplants, but her patience had apparently run out. The doorbell rang. Vinny considered not answering, but he could see her through the window, determined, alert, the kind of person who would wait all day if necessary, the kind who'd already talked to his neighbors, his customers, probably Carmen herself. He opened the door but kept the chain latched. "Mr. Torino, I'm Emma Chen. I believe someone called you about my visit." The words hit like ice water. She knew about the phone call, which meant either the caller had been telling the truth about everything, or Emma Chen was working with whoever had impersonated a dead man's voice. "Don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "I have documents I think you'll find interesting. FBI surveillance photos from December 1962. Communications between the Justice Department and CIA regarding Operation Mongoose. Financial records showing payments to an asset codenamed Songbird." Through the gap in the door, Vinny could see the envelope's thickness. Whatever was inside, it was substantial, real. The kind of evidence that could crack open secrets that had been buried for 40 years. "I don't know nothing about any operation." Phyllis McGuire's real name was Phyllis Ann Russo, Emma continued as if he hadn't spoken. "She was recruited by the FBI in 1961, after they caught her passing bad checks in Las Vegas. She agreed to infiltrate Sam Giancana's operation in exchange for federal protection and a clean record." Vinny's hand tightened on the door handle. Each word was another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed ignorance. "The night you witnessed Bobby Kennedy approach her at the Villa Venice, he wasn't threatening her, he was warning her. The KGB had photographed her meeting with federal agents. Moscow was planning to expose her to Giancana as proof that the Kennedys were using the mob's own women against them. You need to leave. Mr. Torino, there are people who will kill to keep this information buried. People who've been watching you for 40 years, making sure you stayed quiet. But now that I'm here, asking questions, showing documents." She paused, letting the implications settle. "Your silence isn't protecting anyone anymore. It's just making you a liability." Vinny slammed the door, but he could still hear her voice through the wood. "I'll be at the Pier House until tomorrow evening. Room 237. When you're ready to stop running from the truth, you know where to find me." The envelope of documents sat on his kitchen table where he'd thrown it after finally opening the door 20 minutes later. He hadn't touched it since. Didn't need to. The very fact that it existed meant everything he'd spent 40 years protecting was already lost. His hands shook as he poured bourbon into a coffee mug, the good stuff he saved for Christmas and anniversaries. 3 fingers became 4. 4 became half the mug. Outside, the Florida sun blazed with tropical indifference, but inside Vinnie's house felt cold as a Chicago morgue. The photographs were on top, black and white surveillance shots taken with telephoto lenses from across Michigan Avenue. Phyllis McGuire, Phyllis Russo, sitting in a coffee shop with a man in a dark suit who had "Federal Agent" written in every line of his posture. Another photo showed her passing an envelope across the table. A third captured her leaving through the back exit while the agent went out front. Beneath the photos, FBI memos with classification stamps and redacted paragraphs. Asset reports filed under the code name Songbird. Financial records showing monthly payments deposited into an account at First National Bank of Nevada. And at the bottom of the pile, a carbon copy of a Western Union telegram dated December 20th, 1962, 4 days after the Villa Venice incident. Songbird exposure imminent. Stop Moscow has photographs. Stop recommend immediate extraction. Stop Operation Mongoose compromised. Stop. The telegram was signed with initials that made Vinnie's blood freeze. RFK. Robert Francis Kennedy, the Attorney General who'd grabbed Sam Giancana's woman in front of everyone in the bar, whose calm reaction had shocked them all because they'd been watching the wrong performance. Bobby hadn't been threatening Phyllis McGuire. He'd been trying to save his informant's life. The bourbon burned, but not enough to wash away the taste of 40 years of lies. Vinnie thought about Maria, his first wife, dead now 15 years, and how she'd never understood why he'd insisted they leave Chicago so suddenly in January 1963. 7 months pregnant, and he'd dragged her to Florida like they were running from the plague. "We need a fresh start," he'd told her. Somewhere warm for the baby. The truth was simpler and uglier. He'd been terrified. 3 days after the Villa Venice incident, Phyllis McGuire had disappeared. Just gone, like she'd never existed. The newspapers ran a small story about her taking a vacation in California. But Vinnie knew better. You didn't take vacations when Moscow had photographs that could get you killed. 2 weeks later, one of Sam's lieutenants had been found floating in Lake Michigan with his throat cut. Then another body turned up in a car trunk at Midway Airport. The outfit was cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might have known about Songbird. Vinnie had counted the days until they came for him. He was the bartender who'd heard everything, seen everything, whose silence had been bought with $300 and a gentle warning about Chicago winters. But the knock on his door never came. Weeks turned to months, and gradually he'd convinced himself that maybe he was small enough to forget about. Just another working stiff who'd learned to keep his mouth shut. Now he understood the truth. They hadn't forgotten about him at all. They'd been watching, waiting, making sure their investment in his silence paid dividends year after year, decade after decade. The mysterious caller hadn't been Sam Giancana's ghost. It had been his successors, the men who'd inherited the outfit's long memory and longer reach. The phone rang again. Vinnie stared at it through the bottom of his bourbon mug, watching the black plastic blur and shift like something alive. On the fourth ring, he answered. "You read the documents." The same Chicago voice from before, though now Vinnie could hear the machinery behind it, voice modulation software, the kind that could make anyone sound like a dead mob boss. "Why now?" Vinnie's voice came out as a croak. "Why after 40 years? Because Miss Chen isn't just a documentary filmmaker, Vincent. She's CIA, deep cover, working a congressional investigation into Kennedy-era operations. And her real target isn't Phyllis McGuire or Operation Mongoose." The words hit like hammer blows. "Then who? The men who killed Bobby Kennedy weren't random fanatics, Vincent. They were cleaning up loose ends, silencing witnesses who knew too much about Songbird, about Moscow's penetration of American intelligence, about which senators and judges were taking money from both sides." The implication crashed over him like a wave. "They think I know who ordered the hit. You were there that night. You saw Bobby hand Phyllis that final warning. You're the only living witness to proof that the Kennedys were running double agents against both the Soviets and the mob." A pause. "The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice to keep that secret buried?" Through the kitchen window, Vinnie could see Carmen's car turning into the driveway. Home early, probably worried sick. In 6 hours, Sophia would call for her weekly check-in, full of stories about chemistry class and college applications. The documents on his table could destroy them all or save them, but first he had to decide which side he was really on. Vincent? Mrs. Martinez said she saw a woman at our door this morning. Said she looked like government. Documentary filmmaker. The lie came easily after 4 decades of practice. Asking about Chicago, I told her we didn't know nothing. Carmen's relief was visible, shoulders dropping as she set down her purse. She'd lived through enough of his nightmares to fear anything that brought Chicago back into their lives. Good, we don't need that kind of trouble. But as she moved around the kitchen making lunch, chattering about the morning's customers and the new shipment of rum, Vinny felt something crack inside his chest. The weight of protecting her, protecting all of them, had been bearable when he thought it was just about keeping old secrets buried. Now it felt like drowning. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number, check your email. Vinny opened his laptop with trembling fingers. One new message from an encrypted account, subject line blank. The email contained a single attachment, a video file dated 3 hours ago. The footage was grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed Sophia walking across the University of Florida campus, backpack slung over one shoulder, talking animatedly with a classmate. Happy, innocent, 16 years old and unaware that men in Chicago were watching her every move. The video ended with a close-up of her face, freeze-framed on her smile, Vincent's eyes looking back at him across 40 years and 1,000 miles. His phone rang immediately. Beautiful girl, the Chicago voice said. Smart too, from what I hear. Plans to be a doctor, save lives. A pause filled with ice cubes and malice. Be a shame if those plans got interrupted by family troubles. You son of a bitch. Now, Vincent, no need for harsh words. We're all friends here, have been for 40 years. All we want is to keep things friendly. The voice modulator couldn't hide the smile behind the words. Miss Chen made you an offer this morning. Real generous, from what I understand. Federal protection, witness relocation, new identities for your whole family. Vinny's blood froze. They'd been listening. To his house, to Emma Chen, probably to every conversation he'd had since she arrived in Key West. Here's what you're gonna do. Tonight you're gonna call Miss Chen. Tell her you remember things different than what's in those documents. Tell her Phyllis McGuire was just Sam's girl and Bobby Kennedy was just flexing federal muscle. Tell her the only conspiracy was in her imagination. And if I don't, then Sophia's gonna have a little accident. College campuses are dangerous places these days. Lot of unstable people around. Tragic things happen to good kids all the time. The line went dead again, leaving Vinny staring at his granddaughter's frozen smile on the laptop screen. Everything he'd built, everyone he'd loved, all of it, hostage to a 40-year-old secret that had never been his to keep. Carmen appeared behind him, drawn by the sound of the laptop. Vincent, what are you? She stopped, seeing Sophia's face on the screen, seeing the expression on her husband's face. They know about Sophia, Vinny whispered. Carmen went white. She didn't ask who they were. After 35 years with Vincent Torino, she'd always known this day might come. What do they want? For me to lie, to protect the people who killed Bobby Kennedy. The words hung between them like a confession. Carmen sank into the chair beside him, her hand finding his across the kitchen table where they'd shared 15,000 meals, never talking about the shadows that followed them south from Chicago. Then lie, she said simply. Whatever happened 40 years ago, it ain't worth Sophia's life. Vinny looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time in months. The gray in her dark hair, the lines around her eyes from squinting through cigarette smoke at the bar, the wedding ring that had worn thin from decades of hard work. She'd never asked him to explain his nightmares or his sudden silences, had never questioned why they'd left Chicago, or why he sometimes watched the news with the sound off, reading lips like a man afraid of hearing certain names. She just loved him and trusted him and built a life around the fragments of truth he'd been able to share. Now he was going to ask her to run again. What if I told you the people making threats weren't the real enemy? Vinny pulled the envelope from under the bourbon bottle. What if the documentary filmmaker is CIA, and she's trying to expose the men who really killed Bobby Kennedy? Carmen stared at the envelope like it might explode. Then I'd say we're in deeper shit than I thought. For the first time in hours, Vinny almost smiled. His wife had always been smarter than anyone gave her credit for. Emma Chen is waiting for my call. She says she can protect us, but we'd have to disappear. New names, new lives. Again? Carmen's voice was steady, but Vinny heard the exhaustion underneath. We're too old to start over, Vincent. Not if it means Sophia lives. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, processing 40 years of half-truths, and the impossible choice now laid bare. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of every sacrifice she'd already made for this man and his terrible knowledge. "What do you need me to do?" "First we call Sophia. Tell her to pack a bag and stay with friends tonight. Make up some excuse, gas leak, whatever. Just get her away from that campus." Carmen nodded, already reaching for her phone. "And then?" "Then I call Emma Chen." Vinny pulled out the business card she'd left wedged in his door frame. But not to lie, to tell her everything. The words tasted like copper pennies and old cigarettes. 40 years of silence, shattered with a single decision that would either save his family or destroy them all. Carmen's call to Sophia went to voicemail. She tried again, still nothing. By the third attempt, her hand was shaking as she pressed redial. "She always answers," Carmen whispered. "Always." A text message appeared on Vinny's phone. "Having trouble reaching someone? College kids these days always so busy. Maybe try again in a few hours." The message included another photo: Sophia walking into her dormitory building, unaware of the telephoto lens tracking her movement. The timestamp showed it was taken 20 minutes ago. "They're watching her right now," Vinny said, his voice hollow. "Jesus Christ, they've probably been watching her for years." Carmen's face had gone ashen. "How is this our life, Vincent? How did loving you mean living in fear for 40 years? It was the first time she'd ever asked directly. The first crack in the wall of willful ignorance they'd built together, brick by brick, decade by decade. Vinny looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not just the exhaustion but the anger underneath. 40 years of swallowing questions, of accepting half-truths, of pretending their sudden departure from Chicago had been about fresh starts instead of survival. "Because I was 23 and stupid and thought I could serve drinks to monsters without becoming one myself." The confession came out in a rush. "I took their money to keep quiet about Bobby Kennedy and a mob informant, and it turned me into an accessory to murder." Carmen absorbed this like she'd absorbed everything else, silently, completely, with the kind of strength that came from loving someone despite their poison. "What kind of murder?" "The kind that changes history." Vinny pulled the envelope toward him, his fingers tracing the manila edges. "The woman Bobby grabbed that night wasn't Giancana's girl. She was feeding information to the FBI about Soviet money flowing through the outfit. When Moscow found out, they threatened to expose her unless the mob eliminated Bobby Kennedy." The implications hung between them like smoke. Carmen had lived through the 60s, watched the Kennedy assassinations on television, seen the conspiracy theories bloom and die. But this wasn't theory. This was her husband's voice telling her that men she'd served drinks to, men whose tips had paid their rent, had helped orchestrate one of the darkest moments in American history. "And you knew this for 40 years?" "I suspected. I saw Bobby's face when he whispered to her. I saw how scared she looked. 3 days later she disappeared and Sam's people started dying." Vinny's hands shook as he opened the envelope again. "I thought if I kept quiet, if I stayed small enough, maybe they'd forget about me. But they never forgot. They just waited." Carmen stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the palm trees swaying in the afternoon breeze. Key West suddenly felt like a stage set beautiful but false, a performance they'd been giving for 4 decades while the real world watched from the wings. "So what happens now? We tell this Emma Chen everything, and then what? We become witnesses in some congressional hearing? We put Sophia's picture on the evening news as the granddaughter of the man who watched Bobby Kennedy try to save a Russian spy? We disappear," Vinny said quietly. "New names, new lives. But this time we take Sophia with us. This time we tell her the truth before someone else does." Carmen turned back to him, and in her eyes he saw the girl he'd married, young, fierce, willing to follow him anywhere because she believed he was worth saving. Now he was asking if she still believed it. "You sure about this CIA woman? You sure she's not just another kind of monster?" Vinny looked at the documents spread across their kitchen table: surveillance photos, classified memos, bank records that could topple governments. Emma Chen had brought him everything, handed him proof of secrets that men had killed to protect. If she'd wanted him dead, there were easier ways than showing him evidence of his own complicity. "No," he admitted. "I'm not sure about anything anymore, but I'm sure about what happens if we do nothing." Carmen sat back down and picked up the photo of Sophia. Their granddaughter's smile looked back at them, innocent, trusting, unaware that her life hung in the balance of a decision made in a Chicago bar before she was born. "Make the call," she said. "Mr. Torino." Her voice was calm, professional. "I was hoping you'd call. They have my granddaughter under surveillance. No preamble, no pleasantries." The words came out like bullets. "Right now, watching her dorm, tracking her movements." A pause. When Emma spoke again, her tone had shifted from professional to urgent. "How do you know?" Because they sent me photos. Because they've been calling me for weeks, reminding me what happens to people who talk. Vinny's voice cracked. You said you could protect us. My granddaughter is 16 years old and she doesn't even know why she's in danger. Vincent, listen to me carefully. Are you at home? Yeah. Good. Don't leave. Don't make any other calls. I'm 40 minutes out, but I've got people closer. The sound of car doors slamming, engines starting. What did you tell them? Nothing yet. Vinny looked across the table at Carmen, who was gripping Sophia's photo like a lifeline. But they want me to call you back tonight. Tell you I don't remember things the way your documents say. They're monitoring your communications. Phone, probably internet, maybe even the house itself. Emma's voice was tight with concentration. Vincent, I need you to trust me for the next hour. Can you do that? Across the kitchen, Carmen was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at their granddaughter's smile. 40 years of running, of keeping quiet, of believing that silence could protect the people you loved, and now silence had become another kind of prison. What choice do I have? You have more choice than you think. These people, the ones calling you, threatening Sophia, they're not the outfit. They're the men who took over when Giancana died. Intelligence assets, politicians, businessmen who've been using mob connections to hide their real employers. The engine noise on Emma's end grew louder. The conspiracy didn't end with Bobby Kennedy's death. It evolved. Vinny felt something cold spread through his chest. What are you talking about? The Soviet money that flowed through Chicago in 1962? It never stopped. It just got more sophisticated. Shell companies, legitimate businesses, political action committees. Sam Giancana was small time compared to what came after. Emma's voice cut through the static like a blade. You're not just a witness to history, Vincent. You're a witness to an ongoing operation that reaches into Congress, the Justice Department, maybe even the White House. Carmen looked up from the photo, her eyes wide with horror. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand that their quiet life in Key West had been built on quicksand, and now the ground was shifting beneath them. They killed Bobby Kennedy to protect this? Vinny whispered. They killed Bobby Kennedy to protect themselves, and they've been killing people to protect this secret ever since. A pause. Vincent, how many people have you told about that night? Anyone besides Carmen? No one, not even our son when he was alive. Good, that's probably why you've lived this long. The background noise changed. Emma was slowing down, pulling over. The men threatening you think you know more than you do. They think Bobby whispered more than just a warning to Phyllis McGuire that night. What do you mean? They think he gave her names, a list of American officials working for Moscow, and they think she might have passed those names to you before she disappeared. The kitchen tilted around Vinny like a funhouse. 40 years of nightmares, of looking over his shoulder, of moving his family across the country based on 30 seconds in a Chicago bar that he'd apparently misunderstood completely. I don't know any names. Bobby and Phyllis, they barely spoke. A few words, that's all. I believe you, but the people watching Sophia don't. Emma's voice was urgent now. Vincent, in about 20 minutes, you're going to see cars pull up outside your house. Federal marshals, my people, a whole parade of government vehicles. Your neighbors are going to think you robbed a bank. What do I tell them? Nothing. Let us do the talking. A pause. But Vincent, once this starts, once we put you and Carmen into protective custody, there's no going back. You'll testify before Congress, probably a grand jury. Your name will be in every newspaper in America. Carmen had stopped crying. She was listening now with the focused intensity of a woman who'd spent 35 years making impossible decisions seem ordinary. She met Vinny's eyes across the table and nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of their entire marriage. Do it, Vinny said through the kitchen window. He could already see the first unmarked sedan turning onto their street. Emma Chen stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing a bulletproof vest over her documentary filmmaker clothes. The transformation was jarring. Gone was the earnest young woman with her careful questions about Chicago history. This was someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment, who'd built an entire false identity around getting close to him. Vincent Torino, the federal marshal at his door, was polite but firm. We're here to escort you and your wife to safety. Carmen grabbed his hand as they walked through their own front door for what might be the last time. 40 years of marriage, compressed into a single garbage bag of essentials, and the manila envelope that had started everything. The hibiscus bush Carmen had planted their first spring in Key West was blooming bright red against the morning sun, beautiful and oblivious to the end of the world happening around it. 6 months later, Vincent Torino, now Vincent Torres, sat in a diner outside Phoenix, reading his own obituary in the Miami Herald. The story was simple. Elderly Key West bartender dies quietly of heart failure, survived by his wife and granddaughter. A small life barely noticed in passing. The man who'd been Vinnie Torino was indeed dead. The congressional hearings had killed him. 3 weeks of televised testimony that unraveled 40 years of silence and exposed conspiracies that reached from Chicago to Moscow to the highest levels of American government. His words had toppled senators, triggered FBI raids, and rewritten the history of the Kennedy assassination. But Vincent Torres was still breathing, still married to the woman who'd followed him into exile twice now. Carmen Now Rosa sat across from him, reading the arts section with the same quiet intensity she'd brought to everything for 36 years. They'd aged a decade in 6 months, but Sophia was safe. Their granddaughter, now Elena Vasquez, pre-med student at a small college in Oregon, called them every Sunday without knowing that federal marshals monitored every conversation. "Says here they're making a movie about you," Carmen said, folding the newspaper. "Some Hollywood producer wants to tell the story of the bartender who brought down a government conspiracy." Vinny sipped his coffee, tasting the bitterness of cheap diner brew instead of the rich Cuban blend from his old bar in Key West. "Think they'll get it right?" "They never do." Carmen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They'll make you a hero, make it seem like you always knew the right thing to do." The truth was messier. Vinny had testified not because he wanted to save America from foreign influence, but because men had threatened his granddaughter. Everything else, the justice, the headlines, the congressional medals, was just aftermath. He'd been a coward for 40 years, and when they finally forced him to be brave, it was only because cowardice was no longer an option. Emma Chen, whose real name was Emily Nakamura, and who'd spent 8 years building the case that destroyed the Chicago-Moscow pipeline, had visited him once since the hearings. She'd looked older, too, worn down by the weight of secrets finally exposed. 3 congressmen had resigned, 2 federal judges had been indicted, and the FBI had arrested 47 people in coordinated raids across 6 states. Was it worth it? She'd asked him in the safe house in Virginia, surrounded by boxes of evidence that would be classified for another 50 years. Vinny had thought about Phyllis McGuire, who'd died in a car accident in 1963 after passing Bobby Kennedy's warning to the wrong people. About Sam Giancana, executed by his own men to keep him from talking. About Bobby Kennedy himself, gunned down in Los Angeles because he'd gotten too close to the truth. "Ask me in 40 years," he told her. Now, sitting in an Arizona diner with a new name and a new life, Vinny wondered if peace was supposed to feel this empty. The nightmares had stopped, but so had the dreams. He slept through the night, for the first time in decades, but woke up in a stranger's bed in a stranger's house, married to a woman who answered to a stranger's name. Carmen reached across the table and touched his hand. "You did the right thing, Vincent." She was the only person left who could call him that. To everyone else, Vincent Torino was a ghost story, the man who'd watched history happen and waited 40 years to tell the truth. But to her, he was still the young bartender who'd loved her enough to run away to paradise, even if paradise had turned out to be just another kind of hiding place. Outside the diner window, the desert stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Somewhere in that vastness was a new life, if they were brave enough to build it. Again,